Welcome, everybody. The subject for today is organized crime and state-sponsored organized crime. Now, you might think this is a departure from what we usually do here at the International Conflict Resolution Center. It is not, and you will see that from our guest today. I just want to remind everybody that the International Conflict Resolution Center is a not-for-profit, non-affiliated, independent research center based in Washington, D.C. Our primary focus is the study and amelioration of so-called frozen conflicts in the Black Sea region, Eastern Europe, the Caucuses, and of course, reaching as far as Central Asia. Today, we have Olga Lautman, and we are very, very pleased to have her here today. If you were to Google organized crime and the Kremlin, you will see her expertise and gravitas pop up everywhere on this subject. She is a researcher and investigative journalist. She's based in New York City. You can find her on Twitter at Olga NYC 1211 and on the web at olgalautman.com. Ms. Lautman, it is an honor and a pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm just, before we get to some of our, academic-minded, think tankish questions that we have for you, I just want you to freelance a little bit on some developments today, Mr. Medvedchuk and Mr. Kozak in Ukraine, and then after that, could you freelance a little bit on the Colonial Pipeline? Anything you want to talk about, or anything that comes to mind here?
Absolutely. So Medvedchuk, he is one of the stronger oligarchs in Ukraine who's been operating there for decades, and he's he's one of Putin's top operatives. Putin is his daughter's godfather. And he's been working against Ukrainian interest of moving towards the West, towards, joining NATO. And finally, yesterday, the prosecutor issued a warrant, basically investigating him for high treason. Kozak, his associate, who ran a lot of the media, fled to Russia, but Medvedchuk surprisingly remained in Ukraine, and today he showed up at the prosecutor's office very defiant and saying this is political persecution and that he's willing to stay in Ukraine and fight this. But to backtrack, just a few last week, in Donetsk, where Russia, installed, after invading and occupying, they installed their leader. Recordings had dropped of Medvedchuk speaking with the leader of Donetsk that Russia installed, and and congratulating him on the victories and wishing him more victories. These are the people in charge of murdering Ukrainian soldiers. Basically, every week there are a few soldiers that die. So he's basically congratulating them for their operations against Ukraine. And then on top of it, he was charged also, part of the high treason charges was for providing secret information on Ukrainian positions to Russia. So, it's finally, it's decades overdue. And finally, it's coming to a resolution. Hopefully, we'll see what happens from here, because he before was seen untouchable. I didn't think in my lifetime that I would finally see this happening, and that's the best way for the country to move forward, because there are a handful of oligarchs who are, operate on Putin's interest. And with Medvedchuk, not only is he operating for financial reasons, he also finances the terrorist operations. He also was involved with US elections. So, it goes further than just, an issue that's happening inside of Ukraine. So.
Now, what are your thoughts on Colonial Pipeline? And if there are any connections with these two guys in Ukraine, but just standing on its own, just freestyle for a minute for us. What are your thoughts on what's going on with that?
Well, I mean, it's driving me nuts because people are discussing, this criminal cyber group as like independent of Russia, but they're operating in Russia and, but Russia's not, possibly may not have sanctioned this attack. I mean, this doesn't exist inside of Russia. If you're especially this type of target, the Colonial Pipeline, it would have had to have intelligence provided to them. Like they would have had to know this is, it's not like they threw a dart and whatever company popped up. They had to know that this is a pipeline that, carries almost 50% of the oil through US. They had to have some kind of logistics, know, how to, like, I'm not a cyber expert, but as far as a target, that's a very high value target. And here we are in United States, 1 week almost, Thursday, I think will be a week. And basically we have not only a disruption of gas, but we also have panic. We have, people hoarding gas, stations running dry, airports disrupted, and it's turning into a big economic issue. And at the same time, it's also another divisive issue to target the Biden administration because now people are blaming him for it. I mean, he had nothing to do with it. This has to do with Russia. And as far as that, so I believe it is in Russia's interest to see this because all these goals that are happening now is basically what they strive to happen in US. And I think this is payback for our pressure, supporting Ukraine while they were building their military, which, by the way, they haven't moved. Media had reported that they're removing troops without reading the actual statement from Shoigu, who basically, I think out of 100,000, he took out 10,000, but then he rotated them back. All the equipment that, took 1 month to bring to the border is still there. So, I mean, basically, they already have approximately 100,000 troops, which is double of what was in 2014 on Ukraine's border. And at any moment, they can always call back more troops to the border. So, I mean, and also the pressure on Nord Stream, because, we've been pushing Germany to stop the project. And I think that basically Russia sanctioned it. I think they're behind it. And I think they're getting exactly what it is. And it's a warning to us because we really, really need to secure our, infrastructure. We cannot have it. And we even had an attack, like almost a poisoning on our water supply in Tampa, and it just completely like went under the radar. And that was a few months ago. It was like a local sheriff popped out and said, "Oh yeah, one guy, disrupted this poisoning of practically like by Tampa," and it just like disappeared, And this is our infrastructure, and this is what Ukraine was a testing ground for. They have been, before they took these measures to the West, they were testing and perfecting the disinformation, the cyber attacks, the, putting politicians and influential businessmen on their payroll in order to take a country like imploded from within.
Right.
Instead of, using their military, which I mean is not really up to par to Western military.
Well, let me before we move on to some formal questions, do you think that first that given the domestic proclivities of a lot of politicians and people over here, that there's some kind of moles perhaps that are operating?
Absolutely. You have, I mean, quite a few. Like I came here from the Soviet Union. I never thought that, the United States Senate would be peddling Kremlin, well, not even Kremlin, Russian intelligence created, disinformation on the Senate floor. And this is what was happening. And again, if you look at it as a bigger picture, the operation is still ongoing against America. The divisions are ongoing. You
Right.
know, the same operatives are in play. They haven't been, you know, investigated or prosecuted, so they're still here. So basically, we have the Biden administration working and, you know, and trying to do the best they can for the American people and to put their policies forward. But at the same time, we have this like other force, and it's almost like the party of regions in Ukraine. This is
Right.
exactly, you had, you know, the party of regions, who was Putin's loyalist, headed by President Yanukovych. And then you had other Ukrainians who genuinely want to move towards the West and who want to, you know, root out corruption and whatnot. And with that, it becomes difficult because it's hard, you know, to move forward as a country. And we are weaker on the world stage and even for attacks when we're divided. Because right now, like, this hybrid warfare is not clear. You know, it's one thing like if Russia would have dropped a bomb on, you know, New York,
Right.
I would understand that this is
Exactly.
Russia attacked us, and, you know, and then we band together. This is such like blurry lines that unless you recognize it and you lived in it, or you know, understand it, you don't know what's happening to you, you know? So you're scrolling through Facebook and social media and seeing these talking points. And right now, I mean, you even see Fox News is at times siding with Russia against Biden. I mean, you know, and that's very dangerous as a country, because we need to be united in order to face our enemies, Russia, or anyone who is seeking to weaken us, Russia, China, Iran, and so forth.
We're going to get to Iran soon. But just one last thing really quick. I mean, can the Biden administration or any of these other governments that we might be talking about who are in these direct frozen conflicts, you know, it could be Moldova, it could be Georgia, why do these leaders, why are they so reticent about saying, look, you know, the pipeline thing wasn't my fault. This is Vlad Putin. We're going to try to fix it, but don't blame me for this, for you sitting in line. Well, you're sitting in line because you're trying to fight psychologically, you know, that's another question.
Yeah.
But don't blame me for that. Where is this reticence about just naming the devil, basically? I think that's the phrase.
That is exactly what I've been asking for over a decade, because I mean, honestly, we've gotten this far and this dangerous in the world, and a lot of it could have been stopped in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia. Had the West banded together and, you know, and confronted Russia like, you know, with multi-pronged approach, then possibly their involvement in Syria, Ukraine, US, Brexit, I mean, Montenegro, you name it, it might have, like, you know, disrupted it. And I mean, a lot of it is, I think, because Russia, you know, operates, like, people think of the mafia in United States as, you know, like John Gotti and like the Italian mafia and the movies that glorify it and make it like exciting. But those people didn't work with intelligence. They didn't work with the government. They aren't the government. They, you know, didn't have geopolitical goals, or at least maybe they don't in particular, but they didn't carry out tasks for that. And here, what, since the Soviet Union days, Russia, well, the Soviet Union and then going forward, Russia, they're excellent in finding divisions. They're excellent in finding loopholes. I mean, they studied our financial systems, same with Europe. They studied, you know, the best ways to kind of move in and then take us from inside. And then that's why you see, like, you know, the lawyers, I mean, in any other normal world, after what happened in 2016, you shouldn't have lobbyists and lawyers on K Street, you know, working with Deripaska while he's on under investigation for, you know, interference in our election. But unfortunately, the money is too good. At the same time, they're compromising you. And then once you know, cross a certain level, then they will threaten you, not threaten like physically, but they'll, you know, they can ruin your career.
Right.
And it's almost like, here, you cooperate with us. And a lot of people don't even understand they're cooperating, because it's not like, hi, welcome to, FSB office, the
Right.
state. I mean, it's just, they give you, oh, why don't you do this? Or we'll support your campaign. Or they go to NRA. Oh, we like this idea of, free guns for everybody. Let's pour in some money. Oh, come to Moscow. Let's have a joint partnership. So a lot of people at the beginning don't understand until it gets further and further in. By that point, they worry for themselves too. What are they going to do? They're at a stuck.
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, I had a couple of years ago, when Medvedchuk was president, had gotten on RT America here in Washington a number of times, and the hook or the seduction was that this at the time was a progressive network,
Yeah.
and would kind of hold Barack Obama's feet to the fire and fight these other battles that the corporate media, the CBS, NBC, especially Fox,
Yeah.
wouldn't do. I mean, 2016, that totally inverted. So they were almost like Fox News Light, where at first they were MSNBC Light, and they literally changed their spots overnight like a chameleon.
Because they play the long game. And honestly, with the United States, like the Republican Party, I think, started getting targeted around 2008, when they saw this divisiveness around Obama being elected. And, and I mean, because they feed off of anything. I mean, if you've seen for yourself it being reported, and I monitor Russian social media, they will at the same time support and host themselves, well, anonymously. You don't know that it's Russia doing it, but it is. Pro All Lives Matter and
Right.
Black Lives Matter.
Right.
So they want to see that divisiveness, and it's something, again, it goes back to Martin Luther King days. I mean, this goes back, this has been happening for decades. So it's not like they have an ideological issue, and this is why. I mean, today they're supporting Republicans, tomorrow they could support, Democrats.
Right.
It's a matter, or they could be doing it simultaneously. It's a matter of causing that division, so people don't come together and say, hey, what's going on here? I think something is not right. I mean, you even see now with just in general, even with Liz Cheney, what happened today? Where would you think, and like in a normal reality, that the Republican Party would be turning against Liz Cheney, one of the most
right, that or and the ghost, her dad's visage out there in the back. Well, let me get super specific here. I mean, let's go back to Ukraine. Let's go to Crimea and Donbass. What are the criminal organizations? Who are the criminal organizations that work there? What are they doing? What are they trafficking? Is it drugs, women, arms? And how are they working with the Kremlin in those two regions?
Well, they traffic everything. They make money off of anything that they can make money off. I mean, with Crimea, unfortunately, the Kremlin has turned it basically into a military base. So, that again is dangerous, even for the implications of Ukraine's security, but Europe as well, because, Crimea, it's one thing when it's inside of Ukraine, but you have Crimea there, and it's a very important area, as far as for protecting Europe and Ukraine. And as far as, I mean, they traffic drugs, it's arms, it's everything. I mean, they operate on a global scale. You're constantly seeing weapons being, like we just seized weapons that were heading, I think, towards Iran. And the other day in Ecuador, they seized drugs that were heading, I think, like 2 tons of cocaine that was heading, towards Russia.
Right.
So it's, I mean, it's typical mafia behavior, but at the same time, they need control of ports. They need control, they need to have a network. and they need to have, clear roads and people who will, turn the other eye when containers come in, shipments come in and whatnot. And at the same time, it's the oligarchs. I mean, there's quite a few oligarchs in Ukraine who are doing this, and it's not even the drug trafficking. You would think that's bad enough, and the weapons trafficking. It's also the fact that they control like the energy sectors. They have their own people, and like Durkach, who was known for being involved in our elections with Giuliani and running around and creating
Right.
this nonsense about Biden. He at the same time is in charge of he put one of his people, who is Yanukovych's person too, in Energoatom, which is their nuclear company.
Right.
So I mean, it's having key people in industries and oil and nuclear, and that's where the real danger is. And then of course inside of the government, and
oh, go ahead.
no, and even inside of security services,
Right.
because they've, I mean, like I said, they've used Ukraine as a testing ground, and I mean, Ukraine is infiltrated on every level with Russian operatives who are collecting information, who are causing division. Even with Medvedchuk, I mean, he owned, I think, probably 50% of the media, and that media was there to divide Ukrainians and to cause this conflict, non-existent conflict that they were creating themselves, by going like, basically brainwashing them towards Russia. And, we like Europe is bad, NATO is a threat, they're dangerous. You want to come to Russia and, and join forces with Russia. So, I mean, this is, that's one of their main things. So they control every aspect. So it's basically from what the local person hears in their household to the energy company,
Well, in these specific sub-regions like Donbass and Crimea, is it a situation where they're doing their own thing, they're doing their trafficking, what they usually do to make their money, and then you're saying they're also operating almost as a secret little mole army as well? I mean, so is one entwined in the other, or is it two separate things?
It's all intertwined. It's like, for instance, Putin just like a few months ago appointed the deputy FSB, Korolev. I mean, his associations go to Petrov, Gennady Petrov, who was running one of the biggest mafia operations in Spain. So, I mean, and they know each other, and they, were intertwined in business dealings. Putin's head of National Guard, Zolotov, started out with Mafia in the St. Petersburg days. So, I mean, it's really the country, like there's a very thin line between Mafia, intelligence, and the Kremlin and the oligarchs. I mean, there are pots for him. I mean, it's all one, except what they use, like these cyber criminals. I mean, that provides, plausible deniability. Like, oh, they're here. Oh, we didn't know about this, like, and it's hard to prove. Well, I guess intelligence agencies can, but it's harder to, sell the story that the Kremlin sanctioned that attack. Because
I'm gonna pivot away and then come back to that. But let me pivot away to something interesting that I wanted you to kind of opine on. The Russians have long cracked down, with exceptions, on the I'm just gonna put it in quotation marks, non-Slavic mafias or non-Slavic crime families, but they've also worked with them, with the Chechens. We're talking about the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what role do these non-Slavic kind of outlier gangs have in these regions? I mean, are they basically like the Mafia used to use black gangs and Hispanic gangs in Harlem, in the 70s, or are they co-equal with these guys?
They're not co-equal, but they are used for certain operations. Like you see assassinations across Europe, or even attacks across Europe, like terrorist attacks, and then it goes back to Chechnya. And then again, Kadyrov is in Putin's pocket. I mean, but Kadyrov, is he on the same level as Putin? Absolutely not. But, he gets to operate and do what basically he needs to do. And when the Kremlin needs something from him, he's more than happy to oblige, and again, there's financial purpose for it, and also for the fact that, he can operate because Putin can easily take him out and put someone else in his place who will oblige,
Well,
So
there's, oh, go
Mhm.
ahead, go ahead. No, I was going to
No,
say there's
mhm.
been talk that these guys and in his gang specifically were almost used as foot soldiers when Georgia was invaded. I mean, is that the case?
It could absolutely. There definitely were cases that they were used, and Russia will recruit and reuse the same people. Even as witnessed with Ukraine, you see the operatives that they move from Georgia, then you see their faces pop up in Ukraine to fight the proxy wars, and then you see them in Syria, in Libya, and I mean, Belarus, and it's the same people, the mercenaries basically who Prigozhin controls, who are operating and fighting these wars, and basically wherever they're being sent, and then at the same time, they have local recruitment in Italy, for instance. They just arrested like a 27-year-old for and discovered that there was a recruitment hub in that local city where they were recruiting Italians and sending them to Donbass to fight with Russian forces against Ukraine. So, I mean, it's set up, and at the same time, you think it stops, that recruitment effort is just for that. You have the same people who are most likely trafficking drugs, and the same operations, laundering money, and it's basically the same operation. So they're not really focused as far as with these people. They're not focused at one. They're not dedicated to one area. They will be shifted around. And I mean, Bellingcat is excellent with, identifying faces and saying, oh, look, he fought in here's him in 2015 here, and now he's in 2017 in Syria. And then he moves right back, to through
Okay.
Belarus back to Russia and whatnot.
Well, let's pivot to Moldova, which is a country that we study as well. The Transnistrian economy appears to rely a lot on smuggling and illicit activity, primarily through Ukraine. Can you shed light on that, and what kind of goods or bad things are being done there to boost that breakaway area's economy? Is it is it akin to like the narco states in Colombia? I mean, what shed light on that for us.
I definitely know that there's sex trafficking rings that go through there, and I know drug trafficking goes through there. So I mean, and then at the same time, Russia also has, their military who even with the buildup that they were moving towards Ukraine through Transnistria. So again, and that's another situation where Russia comes, creates a problem, studied a division and turned, like a little pebble into like a mountain, to a point where it now, affected Moldova. And now you have this breakaway region who, who is working against basically Moldovan interests. And then, of course, with the former president, Dodon, who was basically Putin's pawn, operating on his behalf, he was also helping. And I'm very happy with, that Sandu won, because at least she strives again to clean out the corruption and to try to move towards, Western values,
Is there a lesson there with Transnistria, because that is actually an industrialized region that could stand on. I'm not advocating it standing on its own, but mind you, they could stand on their own and have a decent GNP for such a weird little concoction. Is there a lesson there for the rest of the world to see how this region is basically, instead of that, it's basically been turned into like a pirate's den, like Nassau in the 1600s or Jamaica. I mean, it's something that could stand on its own, but it's nakedly corrupt. I mean, is that something that the West can point to and say, look, what's going on here?
I mean, there's a lot of situations because with, for instance, Ukraine, with Transnistria, Romania, Georgia. I mean, especially Europe, I think it's Europe's responsibility in partnering with US to provide the opportunities and to provide a path, but they need to focus on that more because, for a very long time, they've left these little regions as, oh, they're on the side and, and they didn't put focus into it until you see Russia's operations now shifting inward in Italy, France, Britain, Germany, Spain. And I think that if Europe would, would put a path and work with these countries to root out the corruption, to help them, modernize, to help them set up a viable economy, I think, it would help. And root out the Russian influence, because as long as there is Russian influence, there will be conflict,
and I know this isn't your primary area of expertise, but let me shift to the Caucasus. You do have Chechnya and Dagestan. You also have another player, which is Iran. You have drugs coming in from Afghanistan. It seems to be the perfect pipeline, figuratively, not literally, because we have the pipelines there.
Yeah.
There have been rumors that we have yet to check on, that there are FSB people working as border guards on the Armenian border. And then you have 2,000 Russian peacekeepers after the fact that they Nagorno-Karabakh. Yeah, right, peacekeepers. I mean, is that a perfect storm for smuggling and crime? I mean, you say what you will about whatever the government in Baku is doing. It at least has taken some stand against this. What else? And the Turks, that is what it is. But
yeah,
what this seems to be a perfect storm for this. I mean, what are your thoughts? Is there an analogy to what's going on in Ukraine, or is this going to get worse? Could the Caucasus conceivably get worse?
No, it's going to get worse, because at least with Ukraine, you have, a huge percentage who really is working to root out corruption, and you have anti-corruption organizations. You have US, who's heavily focused on, now they're focused again. For a few years, it took a break. But so you have US again focused in Ukraine, and they're creating a working group with Ukraine, and will not only supply them with military, but help them under the conditions that they root out the corruption, which I think Medvedchuk could have fallen under, that could have been like, here, you see, we're trying, because they can't get into NATO unless they root it out. I mean,
exactly.
I am Russian and Ukrainian, and I mean, I want this corruption gone. Like, they have to clean it up. In this case, there is no one monitoring it. I mean, it's basically just left there, for the take. Russian peacekeepers is, I mean, it's like, it reminds me of, I mean, first of all, Russian and peacekeepers shouldn't even be in the same word, because even, for instance, with coronavirus, when they send their humanitarian aid to Italy last year, my first thing was, oh my goodness, this is like an intel gathering operation. And I even put that on Twitter. Sure enough, a month later, the general who was leading the effort was involved in Syria and denying the chemical attacks in, I believe,
right.
the hub. And it ended up a month later that there was evidence that it was an intel gathering operation. So the fact that FSB is working as guards, that's a given. The fact that these peacekeepers are not peacekeepers, they're there to destabilize and, and allow the smuggling and, and basically make sure that all the drugs and whatever else, military equipment, whatever else that they're moving through, that it continues with, no one stopping or bothering it. And for Europe, it's again, if Europe would focus, this is on their, territory. If Europe, along with US, would put focus into these regions, it would make a big difference. Because first, and it has to be a two-pronged solution. You have to focus on Ukraine and Romania and Georgia and, uh, and Armenia. But at the same time, you also have to cut the flow from the Kremlin, because that's my biggest thing that I've been calling for. You cut the money from the Kremlin that's funding the terrorist operations, the disinformation, the buying of politicians. You saw like the last week, Queen Elizabeth's, I think, cousin who was providing information to
Exactly. Yeah.
So you cut this influence, you cut the money laundering, which we have the capability to do. We know where these oligarchs' money is located. We know, we can take care of the financial. Everything else would solve, because it's like you have Putin sitting there with his regime. But like Lukashenko is only hanging on because of Putin.
Right.
It's Russian forces who are shifting in and out. It was FSB flying in last August when protests started to help organize a response. So you cut and corner the Kremlin, all the rest of the pawns will start falling, and then we can go in and at the same time, help these countries to create a normal circumstances to have a country,
Which is what we're trying to
Romania,
do.
yeah,
in resolving these conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. There are people who kind of brush Russia off as a failed economic state. Where is the money coming from that gets funneled into these conflicts, into these criminal groups?
The resources, because even during coronavirus, I was heavily covering, the hospitals and all the atrocities happening last spring. The hospitals look like something that was bombed during World War II, and like nothing, not even one penny got invested. But at the same time, they are very rich in resources and, oil, and they're stealing the money, and that's it. So it's basically collecting everything and not, paying rent and paying for your organization, but you're collecting everything and pocketing it. Putin is one of the richest people on the planet. And his oligarchs, for a failed economy, his oligarchs, together are worth, tens of billions of dollars, So, and the oligarchs also, they, like for them to survive in the Kremlin, it's just they can't just like sit there and collect the money. They have to do something for the money. A lot of them are assigned regions to handle, and this is where their money, they're going to focus on whether it be the Baltics or whether it's Ukraine, and then funnel the money through, fund the operations there and compromise local politicians. So Russia is a threat, because even though you cannot look at the economic status, because even at the end of the Soviet Union collapse, Khrushchev, the KGB head, he funneled approximately $60 billion through shell companies, when the KGB saw the signs that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. So within those few years, he was funneling money out. So here you have a country on the verge of collapse, but at the same time, $60 billion is not pocket change, to move into,
no. Well, is there such a thing as, the American Mafia? They had the kick up or the tax. Are these criminal groups, whether they're Slavic Mafia or non-Slavic Mafia, are they kicking up a portion of their proceeds from trafficking drugs, arms, to these guys, and then these guys feed it into the Kremlin, or is there something more sophisticated at work here?
Well, they are definitely paying to operate, because they wouldn't operate without it. As far as I know, even one like very well-known mobster who's been operating for decades, who was on the FBI's most wanted list for a decade or so. He gives 50% of the earnings to Patrushev. This is what I was told. I never verified it, but it wasn't the first time I heard it. And I mean, and Patrushev is the National Security Council. I mean, that's, right there next to Putin.
Yeah.
So they definitely give money. And at the same time, they just like these cyber criminals, quote unquote, they use mafia to smuggle weapons where they don't want their fingerprints, because then they can again have the plausible deniability of saying, oh, we didn't know this. This is mafia. Like, for instance, Mogilevich, he was selling weapons to Afghanistan.
Right.
During the 2000s, which I think Felix Sater supposedly was providing information on it.
Right.
I'm not sure what that is about. But the point is, you see the mafia, he wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it on the Kremlin's behalf, but they just didn't want to officially say we are supplying these weapons. So they used the mafia to do this. And at the same time, the mafia also compromises officials, because there is a very well-known story in Russia, for instance, that Mogilevich, he had set up base in Hungary, and the famous story is that he was paying kickback to Orban, and in 2008, he got arrested in Russia, and he provided the Kremlin, Patrushev, tapes of his dealings with Orban. Orban was summoned to the Kremlin and then came back, and you see where Hungary is today. And Orban is one of Putin's biggest cheerleaders. So it's not just even dealing with the mafia, like, oh, this is mafia, it has nothing to do. No, it has geopolitical implications, because now something like this, where it could have been taking extra money as kickbacks, turns into a point where Hungary is moving more towards the far right. The far right forces are dragging the country completely away from European values.
Right.
And they block everything, anything, any kind of resolutions or any kind of, votes. They're constantly siding with the Kremlin, So,
no, we've seen that. I mean, and that's, do you think that if the Kremlin can use that kind of mafia tactic as a foreign policy, why would they have a problem with Ukraine going to NATO if they could control Ukraine and subvert NATO from within, or the EU from within? I mean, is that something that sounds far-fetched, or is that like a plan B?
No, because they worry that once they do get into NATO, I mean, NATO as an organization, as a unit, is powerful. You have people maybe inside who kind of are like moles, but with that would have military weapons, right?
The Article 5, yeah, they'd have to,
yeah. So no, they wouldn't take that kind of gamble, because again, these mafias run operations, but they're not sophisticated to take down NATO.
What about the EU though? I mean, would that be a coup to have a country have a partner basically for Hungary, subverting EU policies in that way? Is that kind of far-fetched, or is that something that is possible?
Well, it's happening now as it is. You see what's happening, because you see even within Germany, I mean, there's absolutely no logical reason to have this pipeline go forward, to even have begun. And you see that pull within Germany, and then you see Schroeder, who is pushing this pipeline, Nord Stream 2. I mean, he's on Gazprom. He's, another one who is very close with Putin. Warnick, who's also involved, served with Putin. He was a Stasi agent that Putin recruited in Dresden days. And now he's in charge of this Nord Stream 2 project.
Right.
And I laugh, because I'm like, this is like the KGB Stasi pipeline. But I don't think as a whole, so they can do small operations like that, but it would be too much of a gamble to allow Ukraine, because there's too much good forces in Ukraine. If there weren't, believe me, even United States wouldn't even put that much emphasis in helping Ukraine, supplying them with weapons. It's just that we have a lot of corruption there. We have a lot of people who are on the Kremlin's payroll, and a lot of espionage, but there are more good forces who are pulling us. It's like what right now with the United States. I mean, we're on the verge of, we almost lost our democracy over the past 4 years.
Right.
We're still under attack, but we're still strong enough to fight back. And we're still strong enough to maintain our country, even though there's like a maybe 30%, faction of it that has just gone crazy,
Yeah.
So there's a lot
we'll
more.
see. We'll see about what happens in the midterm elections, though. But that's a scary thought. But let me finish with this, and if you could help us out with terminology. A lot of, and this is true even in the think tank community. You've touched on this during our talk, but there is a difference between the actual oligarchs and the gangs and the mafia. Could you just run us through, just in terms of terminology, what the basic differences are, and then we'll finish up with that.
The oligarchs are like the more professional. No, for instance, you have, like, for instance, Deripaska is an oligarch, but again, he was taken under the roof. He was given a roof in the 90s during the aluminum wars by a known mafia person.
Right.
And he was kind of brought up and whatnot. But the oligarchs are just more polished. I mean,
Right.
they're just more polished. They have their companies. They're more well accepted. I mean, you have people who are dealing with a Deripaska and, a Vexelberg or Friedman on like the global stage, whereas you don't have these people dealing with like Borov Zakon, who hires contract killers.
Right.
Do they operate along the same means, and do they kind of work together? Absolutely. And I mean, it was very evident, and just you see the cross, even in their rise in the 90s, even like Friedman, who's Alpha, right? He grew up. I mean, he was the stories like on the global stage, he's well accepted, and yes, he's like close to Putin. But then if you read like the Russian archives, I mean, he was smuggling cocaine from China in the early 90s, working with mafia. His brother was working with FSB at the time, and when it was switching over before that, KGB. So, I mean, it's just, but then, once they kind of like rose up, and they're like the more, I guess, the mafia in the suits.
Right.
They're more like the ones that are more acceptable to sit down with,
And they have their legitimate businesses. They're, software or energy or manufacturing, basically.
Well, absolutely. The businesses are legitimate. Again, you see what happens with like the software, like you end up dealing with it, and it ends up that they, are collecting intelligence or whatever it is. So their businesses still serve the purpose of the Kremlin. You see Vexelberg, with his company, but he was still moving money towards the Trump campaign in 2016. Right. Via he himself, via his cousin. So, I mean, he wasn't doing it because he likes Trump. He was doing it because the Kremlin had ordered him and, had said, this is the amount of money that needs to get into the Trump campaign. And, this is who's going to move it, So they are in, they do have their industries and their companies, but at the same time, they serve at the pleasure of Putin, or else they wouldn't exist.
Well, let me just close with this, and this is just be your opinion. You're not a social scientist, I don't think, and you're not a political scientist, I don't think, but put on those caps. Domestically, why is the average Russian content to live in basically an organized crime state? I mean, what are they getting out of it if things are falling apart, things are broken, things are old and shabby? Is it just naked nationalism, or what is it?
It's a combination, and that I can actually answer because I have family in both regions, in Ukraine and in Russia. It's a combination. It is one, they've never had anything different. I mean, if you go back even the past 100 years,
Right,
it's gone from, massacres to, maybe Brezhnev was a little bit better, but I mean,
right,
he used, schizophrenic, institutionalization of people who like question the system.
right,
So, Putin's actually bringing that back in the outer regions, and Gorbachev, I mean, it's not like that there was so much freedom, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, it just happened so quick and so uncontrolled that under Yeltsin things were very unstable. So the Russian people they haven't had experience. They had a chance of democracy. It was thwarted in the 90s because of the mafia and the fight within mafia groups for gaining the resources in the companies. And then when Putin came, he kind of like put in his own people and arrested and jailed, and people went into exile, seized their companies, and kind of streamlined it. So the operation is basically the same, except it's his trusted people who are running the operation. So they never had anything different, and then when you actually do try to speak out, you get arrested, and people think like it's like the United States. It's not even like Ukraine. In Ukraine, you can freely sit there and say whatever you want about Zelensky, and nothing's going to happen.
right,
Like, I'll give you a perfect example. Somebody just recently, an artist, the day before, for something that he criticized of a school shooting, which again happened in 2018, he posted something on Instagram. He got charged with terrorism.
right,
So, and with this, I mean, people came out to protest for Navalny in January, and within a 2-week period, 15,000 people got arrested. If the arrest was it, that's one thing, but it goes further. You get blacklisted. Now you have FSB monitoring you. They are destroying your families. They threaten to take away your children. This is what's happening in Belarus because they use the same tactics.
right,
They'll take your children away. The little job that you have, you'll lose your job and you won't be able to get another job because, you're on a blacklist. And they use these tactics to basically upend a person's life. And the only way to take down that regime is for, 1 million people to come out in Moscow
right,
every day and not stop. But as long as it's 10,000, 20,000, at a point you even see in Belarus, it's really sad. But, between the torture and the killings and the abductions and just, the traumatic stress of, an FSB, they're using FSB tactics of, just bursting into your house and dragging you out just for questioning. And it's so,
right. Mhm.
the whole situation is very traumatic. And this is why you see people afraid to rise up, because it's like somebody has to, and Navalny did, and he's willing to sacrifice his own life. But you need a huge percentage of the
Right.
country. And then the rest of the people are content, the ones in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're all connected to someone and they live
Right.
in a middle class life. So they're like, whatever, they don't care what's happening in the rest of the region.
Right.
So.
Well, on that pleasant note, I want to thank you. And I guess, again, our guest is investigative reporter Olga Lautman. You can follow her on Twitter at Olga NYC 12111211 and on olgalautman.com. We are the International Conflict Resolution Center based in Washington, D.C. And we thank you, Olga, for enlightening us. This is something that we really needed to have as a reference, and hope that people will look at this video and use it as a reference going forward. Thank you and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You too. Thank you.